until 7:30, 7 o'clock, and then it will be off recording for our parking lot conversation. There may be media here who will be paying attention, and they may quote some of the things we say. And we want to acknowledge that we are on the ground of that has been cared for and preserved by the Native American groups in Wisconsin. So now I'm turning it over to you, Amy, because I can't remember anything else.
Sounds good, Neil. All right. So this evening we have a lot of information to cover. You may want to get out a pen or pencil, something to write with or something to write on. As always, our chat is going to be a place where a lot of excellent information is placed. We encourage you as the audience to feel free to include information in the chat. We always find that helpful. This evening, we are going to be discussing Red Summer, and it's a little unique the way our video lineup is going to go. A lot of us may be or have been becoming more familiar with the Tulsa Massacre, which is actually outside of Red Summer. So Red Summer occurred in 1919. From the spring until the fall of that year. As many of you know, the Tulsa Massacre occurred in 1921. So we will be having a conversation about Red Summer, and there will be some inclusion of the Tulsa Massacre. So let me begin by kind of laying out our evening. We're doing something new this month. We want to specifically have a learning objective. And this month, it's really simple. We want you to be intentional about learning more about Red Summer. We're going to have 2 reflective questions woven into our discussion to help you with that. But I just wanted to be very clear that we have a learning objective that we wanted to share with everyone. So our layout for this evening, we'll begin with 2 back-to-back video clips, totaling about 13 minutes. The first one is a little over 5 minutes, and it features Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. that'll give an overview of what is Red Summer. The second, we are going to have an interview style clip with a producer who is amazing, and you'll hear more from her, but she is going to talk about The Rise of Tulsa, which is a documentary that highlights the Tulsa Massacre, but also brings in significant elements from Red Summer. After that, we are going to pause. We're going to use our first reflective question as a conversation frame. And then I have 2 videos for you. Part 1 and part 2, which really outline the Elaine Massacre, which is really a pivotal point in Red Summer, and they'll give more information there. Now, spoiler alert, I do have a current, as of last year, update on new facts that have been unearthed of the Elaine Massacre in Arkansas. If we have time, it's about a 2-minute clip. I will play that for you because it's really interesting. If not, I will include it in the chat and you can watch it as your schedule permits. Then we'll pause for discussion. We'll have our second reflective question. Our team has put together a scrolling tribute to Red Summer, and I'll kind of give you some pointers and things to look for once we get to that point. And then we're going to end with the words of Miss Viola Fletcher, who is one of the oldest living survivors of the Tulsa Massacre, again, outside of Red Summer, but unfortunately connected by the brutality of what happened. We will hear from her in her own words. I just think that's a really powerful way to end the evening. All right. So I am going to stop talking. I am going to share my screen and we'll watch those first 2 video clips back to back. Forgive me in advance if there is a pause. If I need to scroll through an ad, I don't want to subject everyone to that. So I will do that quietly and then turn on the volume and you'll be able to see my screen. And just to give you an update, an alert, there is strong language throughout all of the clips this evening, and some of them do depict lynchings. There is one clip later on, which I will remind you again before I play it, that uses the N-word 2 to 3 times. So I just wanted to give everyone a disclaimer in case you have small children in the room, in case for any reason that you would deem that to be inappropriate. All right.
Unprecedented devastation of a global pandemic, nurturing wounds from a brutal military victory abroad, struggling to accommodate demobilized soldiers into a slumping economy fraught with heated competition for jobs. Jim Crow's separate but equal policies endorsed by the President of the United States himself, now firmly in place as the law of the land. White supremacists targeted terrorist attacks on an all too familiar scapegoat. In another epidemic, Black citizens found themselves on the lethal end of an outbreak of racial violence in 1919, so horrific that the civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson called it the Red Summer. The events unfolding across the United States today, in the wake of the brutal murder of George Floyd, are an eerie repetition of events that marred the history of race relations in this country almost exactly a century ago. African American soldiers returned from noble service in Europe during World War I, fully expecting that their sacrifices to their country would at long last entitle them to their full rights as equal citizens. Instead, the uniforms they wore literally became targets on their backs.
W.E.B. Du Bois famously said that we returned from fighting, we returned fighting. We've saved democracy overseas and we're going to save it in the United States. That didn't happen.
Between April and November of 1919, with the country devastated by an influenza pandemic known as the Spanish flu, racial unrest rolled through the South, the North, and the Midwest, where the Great Migration was just unfolding in its earliest years.
The migration, of course, had transformed large parts of the North and the West. In 1915, there were hardly a few Black people in Chicago. By 1919, 1.2 million people have spread themselves across the map.
This demographic transformation of the color of the urban North, coupled with the stresses of a post-war economic downturn, combined to create the volatile conditions under which African American workers conveniently became magnets for white resentment and fear.
The pushback was fierce. Chicago was racked by fights along a dividing artery between one population and the other. Hundreds of people are dead. Cities are smoldering.
It was one of the most vicious, virulent, and violent race riots in our nation's history.
Small towns were also shaken by race-fueled violence. In Arkansas, for example, white vigilantes joined plantation owners, sheriffs, deputies, and even state officials to battle what they called an uprising. Hundreds of Black sharecroppers were murdered merely for trying to form a union. Yet in the aftermath, a grand jury callously indicted more than 100 Black women and men for their so-called crimes. Of course, racial violence was anything but new in the America of that time. Still, amid the fallout from the Great War, the rising generation, calling themselves New Negroes, was not about to fold their tents. Instead, Red Summer saw Black Americans not only picking up arms to defend themselves, but also utilizing political organizations like the NAACP to challenge the violence in Congress, in the courts, in the media, and on the streets. In If We Must Die, the poet Claude McKay captured the tenor of the times in his immortal call for defiance in the face of tyranny and terror. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back.
They bombed us, and then that is not recognized by larger society. That leaves a deep mistrust. Very difficult for people to heal if their claims and their stories are ignored or doubted.
Barbaric violence was committed against Black people across this country.
Kerosene was dropped from an airplane.
Why did nobody ever teach us this? Because they didn't want you to know.
We completed this in less than a year. Rapid documentary work with an incredible team during a pandemic. About 20 interviews, all done remotely. For sit-down interviews, we probably had 10 people. When we're in the field, probably 5. For this, we started with the archival. We wanted to see what story the archival told just about the massacre. So we looked at every single source we could find for all 5 of the cities that are covered in this film. We shot, I believe, on the Arri Alexa. I believe that was the camera we used. It might have been an FS something. You could see I am not the shooter.
It's a significant moment in the history of Tulsa and a significant moment in the history of the United States. The United States has been the landscape for dozens of massacres that many people don't know about.
Dawn, could you tell me a little bit about the genesis of the project, as well as how you sort of decided to structure the telling of the story?
Deneen was originally supposed to be just a consultant to us because she is a Washington Post reporter. She had been documenting this. She's also a native of Oklahoma, so this was very personal. And as I started speaking with her, I thought, what an opportunity to have a Black female reporter who's from Oklahoma lead us through this story and tell us why this reporting is so important. I didn't want this just to be a history lesson. I wanted to emphasize in as many layers as possible that there were still descendants of survivors of this time period. And we needed to acknowledge that these people existed. And Tulsa was going to dig and try and find the bodies of massacre victims. So pandemic be damned, Deneen was determined to go and be a witness, and we got a camera crew there. And I think that gives a certain contemporary connection to these historical events, that you literally see the unearthing of this story in real time.
It was like they had found people who had been disappeared by history. The earth had unleashed the...
Let's go! Kick that! I don't want this to be a pain in your butt. I want this to be a life.
Did you need to convince Deneen at all?
We got along really well, and I think she really understood that I wanted more than just the facts ma'am reporting for this. It's an emotional story. It's an emotional story for her, but it's an emotional story for all Black people. There have been whispers of massacres and atrocities in Black communities across this country for decades. But here was a person who was going to show you facts that, they're there. If you just look for them, those facts are there to be determined. And particularly where we are now, where we have people denying truths, I felt like it was really, really important to have an unassailable report of this time period.
The film also makes a point of showing that this wasn't an isolated incident. How important was it for you to sort of contextualize this and show that Tulsa is just kind of the tip of the iceberg?
It's been really great that the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre is being acknowledged and studied and written about, but it's a misunderstanding to think that Tulsa was an anomaly. Tulsa was actually just one of a long line of massacres, large and small, across America during the Red Summer. There were more than 25 documented massacres. And understanding that this is not a Southern problem, this was an American problem. But the other thing that I focused on was there's also a resistance story. Black soldiers coming back from World War I who had fought honorably, they fought for America and they came back expecting to be celebrated. And instead they faced discrimination. But once you ignite that feeling of freedom, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. And so they continued to advocate for their rights. That piece of advocacy is often what spurred this violence response.
They got word that trouble was coming.
The white folks are killing the colored.
It seems to me also that success could inspire resistance and oppression. This community was a very successful community, and they were targeted, it appears, in large part because they were so successful.
They were targeted because they were successful. And that's another reframing. How much of a difference does it make to say, this group of people is so successful that we want to stop them, versus this group of people is dangerous, and so we need to control them. Those narratives are very, very different. So people say, like, was this so hard? I actually emerged from this project with such a sense of pride that these people were able to, just a few decades out of slavery, where most people couldn't read or write, were able to form these thriving communities. And a thriving community doesn't mean they were wealthy. There were some wealthy people, but not everyone was wealthy. But what they were able to provide were grocery stores, hair salons, barber shops, schools, proms. They were just living the American dream, which is a calm life with decent jobs and a community support. And that, just the fact of living a calm life, that was a threat. And I think we should think about that as Americans. Why is a Black community that's self-sustaining, why is that a threat to so many white people?
Nearly 100 years ago, there were race riots and massacres across the country. But 100 years later, there's still racism and hatred, and people are still willing to act on that.
Can you talk a little bit about the archival elements too, because you lean very heavily on archives.
One of the challenges of this project was moving images were very rare. So until the 1920s. So that's why Tulsa is one of the few of these massacres that has moving images. Most of them, before 1917 and before, are photographs. For this project, because we had expanded it beyond Tulsa, because we looked at Elaine, Arkansas, and East St. Louis, and Chicago, and Washington, D.C., that opened up a treasure trove of archival. One of them, for me, was the Chicago Race Riot Commission report. So after the massacre in Chicago, that was occasioned by a Black boy wandering into the white side of the swimming beach. And that caused a riot in Chicago, Illinois. But following that riot, there was a commission, much like the commission that we're attempting to have for the January 6th insurrection. There actually was a commission then. And they had not only reports of deaths and wounds and how people were killed, but they also had recommendations for addressing racism and addressing this violence. I think if we look at those recommendations, we will see many things that we are recommending today. Inclusive education, understanding of history and culture. So if we do not study this, we are in danger of allowing it to be repeated.
It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a chapter in a book. It happened to real people.
They burned the whole town down. But it will rise again.
All right. So thank you for being patient with the ad in the middle of that video clip. It's unavoidable with free content, so I appreciate that. So in the first video clip, we heard from Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., who kind of set the context for Red Summer. He alluded to the Elaine massacre, which we'll dive into in our next set of clips. And also he foreshadowed how we will wrap up the ending with the poet Claude McKay and If We Must Die. So stay tuned for that. And then we heard from director Dawn Porter, who her most recent project is Rise Tulsa, which includes the Tulsa massacre, but also the events of Red Summer. So before we open our discussion, I just want to give you our first reflective question, which I will put in the chat in just a minute. But our first reflective question is, what were the short and long-term consequences of Red Summer for Black communities in the immediate aftermath and now? So think about that. Decide if you have a question or a comment, and please put a question mark in the chat. I will call on you. If you want to send me a direct message, I can read the content of that without including your name. But we want to prepare to have a robust discussion. So our first reflective question is in the chat. So as you reflect on that and the 2 video clips that we've watched, please feel free to join the conversation. Excellent point. Thank you for including that in the chat, Susan. I will read it in case anyone doesn't have their chat open. But it says, both then and now, where would African Americans feel safe in the United States of America? Excellent question. I don't have an answer. I would be inclined to say church or houses of worship. But then you have incidences like what happened in Charlotte. So I don't have an answer. Anyone else who would like to join in? Absolutely. And reparations is a topic that we are pondering, featuring later on in our season. But as Katie put, loss of life, wealth, and security, and no reparations. Neil has a question mark, so I will mute myself. Please unmute and join in.
This is not directly an answer to that question, but I was struck by the fact that there was actually a commission that explored these things. And it reminds me of the Kerner Commission that was like 50 years later. And then here we are again. And people either don't know what the commission said or don't want to know.
Unfortunately, yes. And each incident, unfortunately, did not have a commission. But what Dawn Porter was referring to is the race massacre in Chicago, where a young boy drifted from one beach, the waters of one beach that was for Blacks, into the waters of a whites-only beach. And he was stoned until he fell off of his raft. And unfortunately, he couldn't swim and later died. So yes, excellent point, Neil. But there's not always a commission. And what comes out of the commission, I think it's wonderful to shed light on the situation with a level of detail that a commission would provide. But what comes next?
What comes next has got to be what we're doing now. Grassroots people asking the question of what can we do to keep it from happening again? And then doing something about the answers we get to that question.
You know, I can always count on you to provide me a little bit of hope. So I appreciate that. Janet has a question mark in the chat, so please unmute yourself.
I've done a lot of study of the racism in this country, and especially against Blacks, but also against Native Americans. And it overwhelms me that we have people of good heart who are trying to make a difference, trying to understand what happens, how it happens, and so on. But we have way too many people, and especially with our last president, who encouraged the kind of racism that can easily lead to more of these events. And the fact that we can't get some of us, too many people cannot get the racism out of their system. It is very distressing. I mean, there's the blatant racist, but there's also the people who might say, well, I support Black people, but I just don't know who they are, and I don't need to talk to them, and I don't want to know any more about them. So I think there's such a strong and critical and negative response to Black people in our society. I find it incredible that they want to continue to live in this country.
Janet, thank you so much for sharing and adding to the discussion. Benelli, one of my wonderful summer interns, put in the chat, the burden of educating non-Black people on Red Summer is put on Black people, as Red Summer has not been common knowledge. Given the events of this evening, I would guess I would have to agree with that. Nancy also put in the chat, we're learning that trauma can be passed through the generations. What is our responsibility to address mental health issues of Blacks who are suffering today? Both really excellent points. Feel free to answer the reflective question, which is in the chat, and also feel free to share your comments on either the first or second video clip. We have a little bit of time before we transition, but up next we will do 2 video clips, part 1 and part 2. Each of them are approximately 10 minutes, and it goes into detail about the Elaine massacre. As I mentioned before, several of us are very familiar with the Tulsa massacre, but the Elaine massacre was one of the worst that happened during Red Summer. I will pause because I see that Mary has a question in the chat. Please go ahead and unmute and share.
Sorry, I want to unmute and put the camera on too. I look at the reports like the Kerner Commission and the one after the Chicago massacre, and I have not read either one cover to cover. I've just seen bits. And they are both very thoughtful and very enlightening. And the Kerner one in particular, you know, I remember the 60s, barely, I was very little, but I remember people being scared and people being upset. And even in the 1980s, when I first came across the Kerner Commission, I could see how it got buried, is because people were so stressed, they were so much in fight or flight, that they just shut down and said, I don't want to deal with it. Let me go back to my simple life and where everything's nice and rosy. Let's go back to, you know, morning in America. And I suspect probably the same thing happened in the 20s too. And it could easily happen now when we are in such a fight or flight. People are just, they're not thinking anymore. They're just reacting. So I think the biggest challenge for people is how to maintain the momentum at the very point when everyone wants to shut down and wants to go back to normal. That's a open-ended, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I want to break the pattern.
I think engagement in discussions like this, you chose to be here on a Monday evening. I'm assuming there are other things that each of us could have been doing. And our second reflective question will kind of get into that. How do we engage about this? Spoiler alert, some of the content that we've pulled says race riots. And having a discussion about, is riot really accurate? Is this a riot? Is this both sides equally upset and intending to do harm to the other? Or is this attack and defending yourself? Is this a massacre? So I think the language and how we speak about these incidences is critically important. Do we talk about these incidences at all? What do we do when we encounter people who don't believe these things happened, or say, oh, well, that was in the past, that's not going on now, or mitigate the impact of situations like this? And all of those things are intentional choices that we repeatedly make, and we get to choose how we address those opportunities. All right. I'm going to stop talking. There's lots of good information in the chat. Katie, thank you for putting that resource. I encourage all of you, as you are able, to go ahead and drop those resources. I have a few that I will put in the chat. Susan, I'll go ahead and read your comment in case everyone doesn't have their chat open. It says, both then and now, there was a backdrop of right-wing politics. Then there was the Red Scare during the 1920s due to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The 1920s also had a religious backlash against more enlightened thought. I'm referring to the Scope trial. Scope was arrested for teaching about evolution. Now we've also had the backdrop of right-wing politics. The difference between then and now that I'm seeing is that there are many, many more whites now who would not collude with the police. And during the 1920s, the white cowards during the 1960s too. There are whites now who are finally allies, who won't back down. I'm seeing people wanting to shut down, comma, Mary. So alluding back to Mary's comment. Thank you for everyone, including in the chat. Also, Jen, thank you for providing that information. Janet, that looks like a new question mark. So I will mute. You go ahead and unmute and please share.
Yeah, after listening to the other stuff, I've kind of forgotten what I wanted to say, but I will say, whenever there's police trouble, for example, Ferguson, but in lots of other places, what do we look at? What are we exposed to about what just happened there? It's about looting and rioting, and and there's this sense of the denigration of Black people who are really, really angry, that some of that is converted into, oh, they're really just criminals, they're really just gangster sort of people, and there's no attempt to figure out why looting and rioting follows in some of these places, and B, who was it that just said generational trauma, and how does that affect some people's reaction to what's going on? And I think I would just add that to get a cleaner understanding of that. If we look at these discoveries that we've been seeing about Native American graves in Canada and now in the US, of children who've been to boarding schools, there's a sort of response of anger and shame, but you don't have to worry about a reaction from the people that it happened to, because they're dead and gone, and their parents have learned to be powerless in many ways over time. So it's like you can be upset but peaceful, if that makes any sense. And I'm not saying that right, but you don't have to go out and act on it because of the historic situation. So here what we have is race riots that are happening now, still now. And I think that happened in Kenosha too, and that, I can't remember who it was then, that what we learn is Black people riot in the streets and break buildings, and we don't hear about righteous anger and rage, and we don't even have to think about how, if that was us, how long suffering would we be in not generating some kind of really active response to that kind of stuff going on. Well, we're lucky, we're white, so we don't have to think about that.
Thank you, Janet, for sharing that. And I just want to be clear about the separation of protesters expressing their constitutional rights and rioters, and how those are different entities. And we could have a separate discussion about who was doing the rioting, and was that a part of setting the narrative? Oh, here they go again, etc.
Yeah.
Infiltration of peaceful groups. Again,
Yeah.
be a separate conversation. Susan, thank you so much for putting the name of Jacob Blake into the chat. I'm appreciative of that. I also see that you have a question mark, so please go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to Janet, and I mean, my main thing is that we who are allies, who are true allies, we know the truth, and it's up to us to tell the truth. It's up to us to break through what the media is saying. Naturally, there's going to be, I mean, they do take sides. I mean, so you who know the truth just need to separate that and make sure when you're talking about it, you speak the truth and you describe it in the way it really is, and just make people calm down and understand it as it was. Okay, I mean, I heard those things about Kenosha too. I happen to be from Kenosha. In fact, I was born into that uptown area where most of the buildings were burning. So it certainly was very personal to me, but I know the truth, and I know that it's not okay to have a person you've arrested stand right in front of you with their hands up and shoot them in the back 7 times. That's not okay. So, and then whatever happens as the aftermath, I mean, that once these negative things are in the environment, in the air, some chaos does happen, and we don't, I think if Kenosha had truly, the leaders had truly wrestled with the issues that were right there in front of their faces, and believe me, I know what they were. I know I was there. I was teaching there before 2016. So I was there. I sensed that this was going to happen. I mean, you knew that something, if people weren't going to really set things right with the various communities, and it's not just the African American community there, it's also Hispanic American community there primarily. So those two groups definitely are very vulnerable, particularly in Kenosha. And if people, in addition to churches, I mean, the faith community definitely was always there, and there were nonprofits there always who were helping and so forth. But if people had really sat down and addressed things in a more, let's get this done way, seeking solutions way, perhaps this whole thing could have been prevented. But once you have a horrendous act like that, and it's videotaped, people see it, it just angers you. Even if you're not African American, it would anger you. So it's almost like, well, you know, if someone puts bad stuff into the environment, you're not going to get positive back, not without doing something in between. So, you know, I don't have any, I mean, the protest was legitimate. And even if, you know, a couple of people went beyond what would be considered legally protesting, peacefully protesting, that's what happens. That is what happens when you release such negativity into the world. You don't get positive back unless you intervene and do something positive in the meantime. But anyway, my main point is that we who are allies need to stand up, speak out, speak the truth, and don't stop, because that's the only, I'm beginning to see that. I hope it continues. This is different from 1960s. I was there during the 1960s. I saw it, so I know what Mary was referring to. Whites, yes, there were a few whites who supported, they walked hand in hand with African Americans, but too many whites cowered. I mean, and that's why we have groups like KKK, to purposely intimidate other whites so that they do cower and they don't do what they should do, what is right. So yeah, I mean, I'm not seeing people cower now, and I hope I don't. I think this is a new movement. I think this is what I'm seeing. So let's hope that's true.
Susan, thank you so much. Before we move to our next video clip, just to piggyback on your passionate comments, and thank you for those. The way I have heard it described is when an action like that happens, like what happened to Jacob Blake, it is a breaking of the social contract. And it's very odd, and I would say sometimes impossible, to expect that the response would be as if that social contract is still intact. So once there's a break, there needs to be a repair. And once there's a break, it really doesn't make sense to expect people to act as though the contract wasn't broken. Great discussion. We are going to move into 2 video clips that really dive into the Elaine massacre, which was a part of Red Summer, one of the most violent events during the 1919 Red Summer. Both video clips, I'm going to play them back to back. It's part 1 and part 2. So it's about 20 minutes. We'll go into our second reflective question, and then we'll move on with our scrolling tribute to Red Summer, where you'll kind of get a visual of all of the places around the country that was violently impacted. And then, like I said before, we will end with Miss Viola Fletcher. So I will share my screen. Oh, again, the disclaimer, the N word is used 2 to 3 times. I don't remember if it's in part 1 or part 2, but I did want to give you a heads up about that. There is also graphic content similar to the first 2 video, well, the second video clip. So I did want to give you a heads up.
In October of 1919, one of the greatest tragedies in American history occurred near the town of Elaine, Arkansas, in Phillips County.
We are certain that a reign of terror against the Black population of that part of Phillips County took place. We are certain that machine gun crews went out looking for people to gun down. We are certain that Blacks were brought into, in effect, concentration camps and held in all violation of all the laws of the state of Arkansas.
For the next 80 years, many people, Blacks and whites, preferred to pretend it never happened.
Colored people, what fear, had more fear than they got now. A lot of things that they were scared, they're just afraid to talk about.
Thus, not only was a major catastrophe ignored, but even more important, the legacy that rose out of its ashes was also forgotten. My name is Archie Davis, and I'm an actor. I was born in Cogdell, Georgia in 1917, 2 years before the tragedy in Elaine. Yet, despite geographical differences, the world of rural Arkansas was not much different from the world of rural Georgia. Both were part of the South, then a region where Black people were segregated from whites by custom and law. As a Black person, I was forbidden to eat in the same restaurant, study in the same school, pray in the same church, or be admitted to the same hospital. Like every other Southern Black person, I was expected to learn my place as a second-class citizen. And if I didn't, calamity could strike me down suddenly and without warning. I still remember the terrifying stories I heard as a child of how white men in white hoods burned crosses, whipped, hung, and burned Black men and women who had transgressed the racial codes. To me, these tales always carried with them the smell of burning flesh. In the South of my childhood, whites considered the cotton fields the best place for most Black people. White planters needed cheap Black labor to grow and pick their cotton. Among the richest fields in the world are hundreds of thousands of square miles of land in the Arkansas Delta. The men and women who work the land are supposed to receive half the cotton crop in exchange for their labor. But many landlords cheat them out of their rightful share.
The man would take your cotton, and then the man at the store, you had credit, he run the books up on you, so you didn't have nothing. You work a whole year and hand pick 40 bales of cotton and come out with nothing.
They kept him in debt, this Black or white, but particularly Blacks. And he never did get out of debt. So he might be living on the same plantation for 10, 15, 20 years and never get out of debt.
They work you like a dog or something. They was through with you. They would do you just like, I would say just like you would do old dog or hog or something other.
This is the way things were in the South in the early 20th century. But although nobody knew it then, the winds of change are rising, set in motion by a catastrophic war. In 1917, America enters World War I, which Woodrow Wilson proclaims will make the world safe for democracy. Black soldiers fight with courage, bringing honor to themselves and their country. As they return home, they are greeted with the fiery words of the Black leader W.E.B. Du Bois. By the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if we do not marshal our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. Whites react violently to this new militancy. In the Red Summer of 1919, so-called because blood flows in the streets, race riots erupt in over 350 cities. In Chicago, 23 Blacks and 15 whites are killed. In Washington, D.C., 4 whites and 2 Blacks. Whites are astounded that Blacks dare to fight back. On the night of September 30th, 1919, in Phillips County, Arkansas, a small group of Black men and women are also planning a fight against their oppressors. They have organized into a union, the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. Their plan is to sue their landlords for money owed them for their crops and for an itemized accounting of their charges at the store. But the farmers' plans are known to their enemies. Even as they meet, 2 white law enforcement officers arrive at the church. confusion, a white man is killed. His death triggers a massive reprisal. Terror reigns. Whites falsely claim blacks are in a state of insurrection. The local white sheriff sends out a call for men to hunt Mr. Nigger in his lair.
The call went out for Mississippians to come to the rescue of the white men in Phillips County who were under severe attack. And so they jumped into cars and they jumped into trains. And at least according to the oral sources that I've talked to, they fired out of the windows at every black they saw. Women in the fields, it didn't matter. If it was black and moving, it was target practice.
Hundreds of farmers are trapped. Among them is Frank Moore. The whites sent word that they was coming down here and kill every nigger they found. There were 300 or 400 more white men with guns shooting and killing women and children. Farmers are not the only target for the mob. Dr. D.A.E. Johnson, a prominent dentist from Helena, Arkansas, and his 3 brothers are seized. They're chained together in a car and shot to death. Soldiers from the U.S. Army eventually restore order. By the time the shooting ends, officially, 25 blacks and 5 whites are dead. Some say, however, that as many as 200 blacks might have been killed, their bodies dumped in the Mississippi River or left to rot in the canebrake. The stench of the dead can be smelled for miles. Officially, blacks are blamed for the riot.
The general reaction of the white establishment in Phillips County in the aftermath of the riot was a charge that was leveled against the black population, that they were in a secret conspiracy to rise up and to overthrow the white power structure and the landowning class in eastern Arkansas.
I think the Elaine riot was about the fact that black farmers in Phillips County were tired of not sharing the wealth that they were producing. And the Progressive Farmers and Household Union was an attempt on their part to share the wealth.
Because white men have been killed, more black men must die. Hundreds are detained, 67 are sent to prison, and 12 are tried by an all-white jury for the murder of whites. As the trial begins, a mob surrounds the court building, warning the court that if the accused are not sentenced to death, the mob will lynch them.
For a black defendant to go into that atmosphere was almost ridiculous, in the sense that they hadn't even talked to their attorneys who had been appointed for them. The attorneys, for example, in the first trial, the appointed attorney stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I hadn't even talked to my client."
There's always been the effort of the establishment in the South to always maintain that black people get a fair shake. And the basic story is that when you have a black person charged with an offense, the judge would say, well, you know, boy, I'm going to make sure that you get a good lawyer. Then I'm going to make sure that you get a fair trial. And then we're going to hang you. And that's in essence kind of what happened in the Elaine case.
The all-white jury debates the charges less than 8 minutes per man and finds each guilty. The judge sentences all 12 to death. As far as Arkansas is concerned, the case is closed. But for Scipio Africanus Jones, an African-American Little Rock attorney, the case is far from closed. As far as he is concerned, the trial is a lynching that wears the mask of law. Born in slavery, Jones was driven to succeed in life. He worked his way through college, studied law, and eventually became Little Rock's most prominent black lawyer. Jones came into his manhood at a time when opportunities still existed for black people in Arkansas. In the late 19th century, blacks held political office, became doctors and lawyers, voted, owned property, built churches, and organized women's clubs and fraternal groups. By 1919, although segregation is deeply entrenched in Arkansas, Scipio Jones is determined to save the 12 condemned farmers from execution. But unknown to Jones, Walter White, the Assistant Secretary of the NAACP and its chief investigator of lynchings, is already on the case. Back in New York, Walter White recruits Colonel George Murphy, a lawyer from Little Rock, to represent the condemned men. He is a white Southerner, Confederate war hero, a first-rate lawyer, and sympathetic to the defendants. Jones agrees to work with Murphy. Jones and Murphy immediately head to Helena, Arkansas, where racial tensions are still as volatile as gas fumes.
What I find so extraordinary about Scipio Africanus Jones is his courage, his willingness to go to Helena, knowing that his life was always at risk as soon as he crossed the county line.
Knowing he's surrounded by men hoping for the chance to kill him, Jones sleeps in a different house each night. By day, he and Murphy prepare a motion for a new trial. They charge that the presence of the mob and the use of torture made it impossible for the defendants to have a fair trial. Jones gathers testimony from a number of tenant farmers, including Alf Banks. I was frequently whipped and also put in an electric chair and shocked, and strangling drugs would be put in my nose to make me tell that others had killed or shot at white people and to force me to testify against them. The trial judge denies their motion. Jones and Murphy appeal to the Arkansas Supreme Court. The court orders a new trial for 6 of the defendants on technical grounds, but allows the death sentences to stand for the other 6. The first 6 are sentenced to death again, but again, the appeals court overturns the verdict. When Murphy dies shortly after the trial, the fate of all 12 men is left in the hands of Scipio Jones and Murphy's partner, Edgar McHaney. Jones faces an immediate crisis. 6 of the men are only days away from execution. There seems no hope. Frank Moore, one of the 6, watches prison carpenters build their coffins in front of their cells. They showed us our coffins and laughed and said that's where we'll be resting tomorrow night. But we had faith in our lawyer and said, no, that won't happen. Jones needs 4 weeks' time in order to appeal the case in the federal courts, and he knows that the Arkansas Supreme Court will not stop the executions. With hours left before the men are to die, Jones and McHaney surprised everyone by appealing for and obtaining a delay of execution from Chancery Court.
Some folks perhaps would have even questioned the wisdom of Mr. Jones filing a petition in the Chancery Court, which had no jurisdiction. Ultimately, and practically speaking, it turned out to be a brilliant move by Mr. Jones because he did secure a delay of the execution, which bought him and his clients time to pursue more appropriate appeals.
Several weeks later, the Arkansas Supreme Court removes the stay. But Jones has gained the time he needs to file his appeal in the federal district court. The case is known as Moore versus Dempsey. Jones's strategy saves the men's lives, but for how long? The NAACP now brings in Moorfield Story, a constitutional lawyer and president of the NAACP, to work with Jones. They feel their strongest argument is that the presence of a mob surrounding the court made it impossible for the defendants to receive a fair trial. Story and Jones are concerned that the court will reject their appeal as it has already done in a similar case. In 1913, a Georgia mob demanded that a jury find Leo Frank, a Jewish manager of a clothing factory, guilty of murdering a young woman worker at the plant. Frank was innocent, but the judge and jury, intimidated by the mob, convicted him, and Frank was sentenced to death. The United States Supreme Court refused to intervene, and Frank was ultimately lynched. But there was a dissenting voice, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Jones hopes that Justice Holmes can convince his colleagues to reverse that decision. On February 19, 1923, the Supreme Court announces its decision, Justice Holmes speaking for the majority. If the whole case is a mask, that counsel, jury, and judge were swept to the fatal end by an irresistible tide of public passion, and the state courts refuse to correct the wrong, then nothing can prevent this court from securing to the petitioners their constitutional rights. The Supreme Court orders the case back to the federal district courts for further review. Jones immediately seizes the opportunity. He pressures the states to release everyone imprisoned in the case. The state surrenders. By 1925, everyone is released. Jones's victory in Moore versus Dempsey did not compensate for the deaths at Elaine, but it did help prevent future deaths. For the first time in American history, the Supreme Court handed down a verdict favoring Black defendants in a criminal case. For the next 50 years, the NAACP will build on Moore versus Dempsey to win other major victories in the Supreme Court that eventually will help end legal segregation. Although Jones may be little known today, his legacy remains as one of the first Black lawyers to challenge Southern legal injustice and win. No.
I'm going to stop the video there. I will put both links if you want to see the last few minutes, because I was able to find, as recent as last year, an update in the Elaine trial from Arkansas. So I do want to share that. The clip is about 2 minutes, and then we'll go into our last reflective question.
Our Black History Month series ends tonight with one of the bloodiest race riots in the country, and it happened right here in Arkansas. Tonight, there's new information from a fact-finding mission by a Little Rock professor.
This covers the time period of October 1919 to January 1920.
We start with Julian Crawford at the Arkansas State Archives. She takes us back 100 years in Phillips County through photos and newspapers. Black veterans returning from World War I were upset over their wages. They hired an attorney and planned to take the sharecroppers to court, but never had the chance. Historians estimate between 100 and 300 African Americans were killed in what's now known as the Elaine Massacre.
So I've been waiting weeks to talk to you about this new discovery in the ledger. Tell me a little bit about what you all found when you opened this up.
We were able to piece together what happened that night immediately following the shootings.
For decades, the Black workers were to blame, accused of planning riots. But this ledger, found in the attic of the Helena Museum of Phillips County, tells another story.
We discovered that the posse was comprised largely of the men that made up the American Legion Hall for Phillips County. And they attest to this and give a testimony of how they were recruited in this ledger.
Dr. Ryan Mitchell says it and other recently found documents suggest that the white employers sparked the violence, fearing the lawsuits from their Black workers. In 1920, this letter was sent to the Little Rock Mosaic Temple, supporting the ledger's record.
He maintains that the police officers who were there were not there accidentally, and that the plantation owners where the sharecroppers were planning to sue had all sent out men to surround the church, and that they were going to intimidate and shoot into the church. That changes the narrative, completely.
Dr. Mitchell believes there's much more to this story, but we may never know every turn of events that led to more than 100 deaths. He plans to continue searching for more documents to find facts that could change how the Elaine massacre was written into history. We'll be right back.
All right, so that was a lot to take in. Bear with me. I'm going to toggle over to my other screen and pull our second reflective question so I can put that in the chat. But please remember, you can answer the reflective question or comment on that, but also comment on the video that we just watched. Were you at all familiar with the Elaine massacre? Anything that was new information that stood out? All right. So our question is entered, our second reflective question. How would you explain Red Summer? So to someone who didn't have the opportunity to attend this evening or to watch the recording, think about the roles white supremacy and anti-Blackness played in the horrific, widespread atrocities. And I just want to be very clear. When I talk about white supremacy, we are not talking about white supremacists, so individuals, but white supremacy is the belief that people with white skin are superior. So how does that belief system play into the roles of the massacres that we've discussed this evening? And I'm also going to drop a definition of anti-Blackness in case anyone is unfamiliar with that term. It's the concept of anti-Blackness pushes back against the idea that all ethnic minorities have the same lived experience. And also anti-Blackness is being resistant or antagonistic to Black people or their values or objectives. So I just want to be clear about those two definitions: white supremacy, not white supremacist, different things, and then anti-Blackness. So as you absorb all of that and reflecting on the two video clips specific to the Elaine massacre, feel free to put a question mark in the chat so I can call on you. You can type out your question either to everyone or directly to me in the chat. We have a little bit of time for discussion, and then we have prepared kind of a visual scrolling tribute to Red Summer, which I'll play in just a little bit and give you a little bit of a description before we share that. So again, feel free to respond to the reflective question or share any thoughts or reactions you have to the Elaine massacre clips, both part 1 and part 2. And while you're doing that, I will put those clips in the chat. Actually, I'll put all of the clips for this evening in the chat in case anyone wants to rewatch them or share them with others.
I'd like to make a comment.
Please.
I hope I say this right. And it's based on the old saying of the elephant in the room. I was becoming a little emotional seeing the clip from the Elaine massacre and some of the after massacre events, and it felt so identical when I was out at Standing Rock. And in a matter of a few short weeks, the Dakota government passed 133 separate laws that were directed right at the protesters. I couldn't have been 50 feet away when the armed militia there were chambering their automatic rifles with live ammunition. If anybody really wanted to if you wanted to talk back, the force became greater and greater. Once again, it all came back to an oil company, white-based, and these efforts were getting in their way again. It seemed like just like with the Elaine massacre, it seems so similar. So there ain't a hell of a lot has changed since 1919. That practice is still going on to this day. I only feel that I believe Susan said it earlier. I think Amy might have said it too. I think the only relief that I get is just in the last few years with our group, Allies of Native Nations. We have spotlighted some wrongs of the past and have made them public. It's from our little bitty baby corner of the world. And it started to develop maintain some effort there. The city of Janesville, Beloit, Rock County, all signed agreements to recognize Indigenous People Day. People, for the life of me, for the first time ever, I saw people that actually started questioning Christopher Columbus, because he was the top dog, the head banana, the big cheese. He was the one that came to America and settled America, and he, started the first Arby's roast beef franchise here. So, it was that ridiculous. And to come to find out, people with lots of knowledge were surprised to find out this guy had never stepped foot in the United States, and yet we keep teaching it. We're taking our efforts back to the Janesville School District, and we'll be making a motion to literally eliminate that from our teachings of our own children. It's criminal, in my mind, to continue teaching children these false stories.
Billy Bob, thank you so much for sharing that. I agree is my only response to that. Thank you so much. And for the passion in which you shared and being really thoughtful about making those connections. Neil, I see you have a question in the chat. I'm going to ask that you allow me to do the scrolling presentation, the tribute to Red Summer, and then you will be the first person that I come to. So there's a little bit that I want to share before we view the visual tribute. So you are about to view a list of cities that experience massacres of Black bodies. Please note the geographic locations. These massacres were not isolated in the South, as some may believe. Please note the dates and specifically the spaces between the dates. What I mean by that is the frequency and occurrence of these massacres. Please note the duration in some cases. It's multiple days on end. Please note if there is a city or cities that you have a particular connection to. While you are viewing the scrolling tribute to Red Summer, you will also hear the words of Claude McKay in the poem of If We Must Die. The extraordinary poet Claude McKay wrote If We Must Die in 1919 in response to the repeated and brutal massacre of Black people. Jamaican-born Claude McKay was a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. Claude McKay's poignant and simultaneously powerful words are read by the Reverend C.T. Vivian, a champion for and the embodiment of nonviolence. After Reverend C.T. Vivian's passing in July of last year, NPR writer Colin Dwyer wrote the following of our beloved giant. The Reverend C.T. Vivian, for the Reverend C.T. Vivian, a jail was about as familiar as a police officer's fist. For his work during the height of the civil rights movement, the minister and activist was arrested more times than he cared to count and suffered several brutal beatings at the hands of officers throughout the South. All the while, he held fast to the principle, in no way would we allow nonviolence to be destroyed by violence. He recalled in an oral history recorded in 2011. Vivian, who died Friday, July 17th, 2020 in Atlanta, Georgia, at the age of 95, was a proselytizer of the nonviolent resistance from Peoria, Illinois, where he organized some of the civil rights movement's first sit-ins in the late 1940s. To Selma, Alabama, where a sheriff sucker punched him on camera in 1965. Vivian bore the same message. Change must come, and nonviolent direct actions is necessary to bring it about. He was one of the tallest trees in the civil rights forest, Reverend Jesse Jackson tweeted after his passing, calling Vivian a mentor. He never stopped dreaming. He never stopped fighting. We are better because he came this way. So again, you are about to view the list of cities. This is not an exhaustive list. I want to be clear of that, but confirmed cities that experienced massacres of Black bodies. Again, please note the geographic locations, dates, and specifically the time between the dates, the duration in some cases, and any city or cities that you may have a personal connection to. All right, I will share my screen. The tribute is about a minute, and then we will close with the words of Miss Viola Fletcher. Let me try that again.
If we must die, let it not.
Here we go.
If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while around us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mark at our cursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us die nobly, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain.
that even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lie the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back.
All right. So Neil, you had a question in the chat. I will mute myself and yield the floor.
I just want to come back to the thought question, which is, how would we talk about this to people who have never heard it before that we know? Because I think that's one of the key things that we need to take away from our time tonight.
Absolutely, Neil, thank you for bringing us back to that. So going back to our learning objective, hopefully you have more information about what Red Summer is and what it is not. Hopefully you have some resources that you can have conversations that are rooted in historical facts. And hopefully you see the difference between riots and massacres, and you can be intentional about the way you present this information. So absolutely. If there is any, oh, Mary, I see that you have a question, and Neil, we will bounce back to you before we end with announcements, and then the final words we will hear will be that of Miss Viola Fletcher. So Mary, please unmute, and then we will hear from Neil again.
Okay. I'm not sure it's as much of a question, but it's really more a reaction to Billy Bob Graham's statement about comparing Standing Rock. And I think the common element to both Red Summer, anti-Black racism, and Standing Rock and anti-Native since Columbus, it's just an issue of unchecked power. So there are some people who for whatever reason have power, and they have enough power that they feel entitled, and they will protect that power by any means necessary. And it's, you know, it's not a simple thing to go up against that. To try and get to a point, to fight for a point where no one is exempt from justice. And it's a long fight, and we aren't anywhere near over.
Mary, thank you for sharing that. You said for whatever reason they have power. I am a firm believer that the made-up construct of race was weaponized and used to ensure that certain people had power and certain people did not. And unfortunately, the system is working as it was intended. Neil, please go ahead and unmute.
I want to bring us back again to the contemporary thing. Mary's was there too, but the word that comes to my mind again and again as we think about Red Summer is domestic terrorism. We're talking about, when we say riot, it implies Black people rioting. That's what is, that's why we have to use massacre instead of riot. But let's also use domestic terrorism, because that's exactly what this is.
Neil, I absolutely agree. And thank you for bringing us full circle to what we as a team decided to write in our description for this event. I appreciate that. I have one quick announcement and then I would yield the floor. Spoiler alert, we're going to be a little over. I apologize in advance. If you could just give us about 5 minutes, I would greatly appreciate it. So I would like to do a brief plug. I was so fortunate this summer to have 2 amazing racial justice interns. And as one of her final projects, one of my interns, Benelli, is hosting a conversation entitled Showing Up for BIPOC. If anyone is not familiar, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, Person of Color. This event will take place on Monday, August 9th, 2021 from 6 to 7 p.m. I will stop sharing. I am going to yield the floor to Benelli for about 30 seconds to share about her event, and I will drop the registration link while she's talking in the chat. Benelli, please unmute.
Okay, thank you, Amy, for that. So hi, everyone. Basically, my event is to talk about checking in with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in your life. A little bit of a just sharing point. So I am a person of color myself, but I didn't have a lot of my non-BIPOC friends checking in with things that affect the communities I'm a part of, celebrating the joys I go through with my various identities. And I am also responsible for checking in with other Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So that's basically what my event is about. And I hope you all can attend. And I think it's super important and it's not talked about nearly as much as it needs to be. So solidarity.
Thank you, Benelli. I have had an embarrassment of riches this summer. I was fortunate enough to work with 2 amazing young women of color who are vibrant and owning their agency and sharing at such a high level. Their work this summer has been amazing, and I'm so fortunate to have met them and gotten to know both of them. So please, if you are able, do support Benelli's event. The link is there in the chat. Neil, Beth, I yield the floor to my other Courageous Conversation partners. Do we have any other announcements to share?
I'm not sure I have any other announcements except that Diversity Action Team will be at the Janesville National Night Out with a table and invite people to come by Traxler Park when that happens, which is just a second. It's soon. It's August 3rd. So anyway, I'm also glad to have worked with Amy's 2 interns. They have urged us to do better stuff than we have done before, which was pretty amazing already.
Yes, in the spirit of giving full credit, Anna and Benelli were the 2 that urged us to have identified learning objectives for the time that we spent and help to develop those reflective questions. So you'll see more of that as we progress in Courageous Conversations. Again, I just want to acknowledge that it is 7, our usual end time. The final clip that we have, I think it's so fitting to end with the words of Miss Viola Fletcher. The clip is 7 minutes and 32 seconds. As soon as the clip ends, Neil, unless you have anything to add, we will enter the parking lot. I will turn off the recording. I invite anyone who wants to collaborate and discuss in an unmoderated format to stay on and continue to share. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we will end with Ms. Fletcher.
Viola Fletcher, also known, if I can, Mother Fletcher. Thank you. I don't have a mother, so thank you. Mother Fletcher is the oldest living survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. She was 7 years old when she lived through the massacre. Mother Fletcher, you are now recognized to testify. Is the microphone on?
Yes. My name is that, okay. My name is Viola Ford Fletcher. I'm the daughter of Lucinda Ellis and John Wesley Ford of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm the sister of Hughes Van Ellis, who is also here today. I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. On May 31st in 21, I went to bed at my family's home in Greenwood. Neighbors of Tulsa, the neighborhood I felt asleep in that night, was rich, not just in terms of wealth, but in culture, community, heritage, and my family had a beautiful home. We had great neighbors, and I had friends to play with. I felt safe. I had everything a child could need. I had a bright future ahead of me. Greenwood could, Still, Greenwood should have given me the chance to truly make it in the country. Within a few hours, all of that was gone. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see Black men being shot, Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. State and city took a lot from me. Despite this, I spent time supporting the war effort in the shipyards of California. But most of my life, I was a domestic worker serving white families. I never made much money, but to this day, I can barely afford my everyday needs. All the while, the city of this Tulsa have unjustly used the names and stories of victims like me to enrich myself and its white allies through the 30s million raised by the Tulsa Centennial Commissioner while I was continued to live in poverty. I am a 107-year-old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will. I have been blessed with a long life and have seen the best and the worst of this country. I think about the terror, horror inflicted upon Black people in this country every day. This continued committee has the power to lead us down a better path. I'm asking that my country acknowledge what has been happened to me, the traumas and the pain, the loss, and I ask survivors and descendants to be given a chance to seek justice, open the door. All of you know how easy it is to deny that a violent mob threatened your lives and took your property For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its stream of chummers told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes. You have me here right now. You see Mother Randall, you see my brother, Hughes Van Ellis. We live this history and we can't ignore it. It's our lives with us. Oh my goodness. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for Black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history. For Black America, for the white Americans, and for all Americans, that's some justice. Yes, was that it? Thank you.
Do you want to say anything else?
I thought it was another page.
Do you want to say anything else?
Mhm.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No, it's not.
Thank you very much. We appreciate very much your testimony.
Amy, you're muted.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you again for sharing part of your evening with us. We hope that this was time well spent. Thank you for allowing us to go a little bit over and hanging in with us. We will now open the parking lot. I will end recording now.
Thank you for your